Secunder Kermani, our foreign correspondent, we're here talking about the Israel-Palestine situation, what's been going on recently, the recent elections. What are you going to tell me?
I'm going to tell you that basically we're in a new and dangerous phase of this old conflict because on the one hand, you've got increasing anger and resentment amongst young Palestinians, many of whom are turning towards newer militant groups or militant formations, taking up arms. On the other hand, you've got Israel's most hardline, ultra-nationalist government that it's ever had has now come into power, including figures who were once considered fringe extremists. And it seems like we've already seen the deadliest year in the occupied West Bank in nearly 2 decades. We've already seen significant numbers of Israeli civilians being killed, and it seems like the violence is going to get worse.
Secunder Kermani, we're here discussing the Israel-Palestine situation following a number of attacks in recent weeks, and you yourself having been there at the end of last year. I want to start by talking about the election in Israel, which happened in November. But just quickly, this was already bubbling under the surface in the sense that we seemed to be entering a new phase. Within the West Bank, it was already the deadliest year in a decade or more, was it?
That's right, deadliest year in close to 2 decades in the occupied West Bank. More than 150 Palestinians killed there. Some of them were armed members of militant groups. Others were young men who were throwing stones at Israeli forces and were shot. Others were bystanders who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was also the deadliest year for Israeli civilians. More than 30 were killed last year. And so we're really seeing this old conflict in a new and dangerous phase with tensions ramping up on both sides. Of course, the death toll significantly higher on the Palestinian side, though.
And a sense as well that combined with that all is a frustration on both sides as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you have this rising anger in the Palestinian population at the entrenchment of the Israeli occupation. And that's particularly pronounced in places like the occupied West Bank. You know, for a long time, much of the international focus when we talk about the conflict in the Middle East is around Gaza, because that's where wars and conflicts have flared up. But actually, we're really seeing in the last year or so the focus in the occupied West Bank. And that's where there have been, over the last year, thousands of arrests of Palestinians by Israeli forces, almost daily raids going on there. Those raids inevitably normally accompanied by confrontations where young men from the areas will throw stones at Israeli forces. They often respond with rubber bullets, live bullets. People, young Palestinians are killed as a result.
And that's a frustration not just with the occupation, but also with the Palestinian National Authority within the West Bank.
Well, yeah, and it's also those raids, to be clear as well, are taking place because last year we saw a spate of shooting and stabbing attacks on Israeli citizens, and some of them were carried out by people who affiliated themselves with the Islamic State group, IS, basically. Others came from places like Jenin in the north of the West Bank. And so Israel launched these huge, as I say, almost daily operations and raids into these areas, trying to target people who they suspected of carrying out or having links to these kind of militants. Often, really, many of these men operating as kind of lone wolves, without really, it seems, kind of formal direction from Hamas or Islamic Jihad, for example, even though they might have some kind of affiliation with them. You know, what we're really seeing with the PA, the Palestinian Authority, is that young Palestinians see them as too soft on the Israelis because they cooperate with the Israelis on security. At times they will arrest operatives from Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and there's been from the younger Palestinian perspective, there's been no gain for the Palestinian cause in return. And in fact, they see them as being complicit. And they said that you're basically enriching yourselves. They accuse them of corruption. And they are turning to newer formations of militant groups which have been emerging in the occupied West Bank. People like the Lions Den, they're popular on social media. They incorporate people, young men who have links to different groups like Fatah, like Hamas, like Islamic Jihad, but they're coalescing around an area, for example, Jenin or Nablus or Balata refugee camp, and they say, right, we're the young guys from this area. Whenever Israeli forces come in, we're going to be the ones to respond. Some of them have, some of the groups have quite a lot of guns. I mean, I was in a room in Jenin with about 40 young men. All of them had M16 assault rifles. So there is the potential for serious violence. Having said that, a caveat is I was speaking to a Palestinian civil society activist from near Hebron, and he said the media makes a mistake, and include ourselves in that, by sometimes overly focusing on these groups and their capacity for violence, because actually there's such a disproportionate, there's such a disconnect in the capacities of the two sides, and the Israeli army really, it's very difficult for any of these groups to pose a serious, proper threat to the Israeli army. And we've seen that. Often they carry out shooting attacks on checkpoints. Sometimes they could, at times they might hit a soldier or two, but really they're not able to pose a kind of concerted threat to the existence of the state of Israel, certainly.
On the Israeli side, we've also seen a hardening in some ways of their viewpoints, because we've just had, in November, the 5th election in 3 years. And we've seen Benjamin Netanyahu come to power once more with a coalition described as the most far-right nationalist ever. Can you just explain to me what that coalition is and who's in it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the most right-wing government that Israel has ever seen. And I mean, it's led by Benjamin Netanyahu. He's a veteran leader. He's a right-wing figure himself, but he's never been in power with such right-wing coalition partners. I mean, some of the figures who are now occupying senior positions in the government were once considered fringe extremists. I mean, to underline it, the new national security minister, for example, Itamar Ben-Gvir, he's leader of a party called Jewish Power. Now, he's a man who was once convicted of inciting racism, of supporting a Jewish terrorist organization. He once had in his home, until relatively recently, the photo of a Jewish extremist who murdered 29 Palestinians whilst they were praying in a mosque. And this is the man who's now in charge he's the national security minister. I mean, it's difficult to really fathom. His supporters say that he's toned down since then, but of course, most other people are deeply skeptical of that. Then you've got other figures like there's a little Smotrich. He's leader of the religious Zionism party. That's another key coalition partner.
Because they all grouped together, didn't they, in the election? Yeah.
What you have in this coalition is, let's say, 2 or 3 ultra-nationalist parties.
Yep.
So you have Smotrich's party, you have Ben-Gvir's party, then you have some other ultra-Orthodox parties, and their focus is primarily religious. But there's obviously a shared platform. And, the outline that this new government produced when it was formed included saying that the Jewish people have the inalienable and exclusive right to all the land of Israel. And that really speaks to the issue that's at the heart of this conflict and at the heart of this government, and that is Israeli settlements. Yeah. They're widely considered illegal under international law. Israel disputes that, but pretty much the rest of the world says no, they are illegal. And these are settlements that are built basically in the occupied West Bank.
So that coalition is far right, not just in the sense of what you're saying there in terms of settlements and how it sees a resolution to the conflict, which is essentially to have all the land, but it's also about how they view Israeli society in terms of they're very anti-LGBT. They in some ways as well want to turn Israel into a, less of a secular country.
There are certainly fears amongst more liberal and left-wing Israelis about the direction the country is heading, not just in terms of, as you say, the conflict with the Palestinians, but in terms of the country's identity itself. There's been, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, there's been a big movement, a street movement protest against judicial reforms. There is an internal Israeli dynamic at play, but I think at the moment, the bigger concern, certainly internationally, is that conflict with the Palestinians. And to give you a sense of how some of these figures on the right view, the situation, the conflict with the Palestinians, I was speaking to one member of Itamar Ben-Gvir's party, because they talk about wanting to basically take over the occupied West Bank and formalize it, make it part of Israel. But the problem is, what do you do with the Palestinian population there? One, they don't like to use the word Palestinian because they don't recognize. They say that doesn't exist as a figment. Of course, Palestinians totally disagree with that, very offended by that. But their view is that at the moment you have Israel, which is a democratic and Jewish state. If you annex something like the occupied West Bank and you have the Palestinian citizens there under the direct control of Israel, what do you do with them? Do you then consider them equal citizens, give them equal voting rights, for example? There, the concern of the Jewish right is actually you start, because of demographic changes, you might start to lose the Jewish nature of Israel because actually you have a substantial Arab population. So what they talk about really is annexing the occupied West Bank, but not giving equal rights to the Arab citizens. And that's why you have human rights groups basically calling them supporters of apartheid.
So let's talk a bit about your reporting there, as well as the recent, violence we've seen. As everyone is aware, this is an old conflict stretching back to the foundation of the State of Israel. There's been numerous wars, the intifadas. And then, as you said, 2022 was one of the deadliest years within the occupied West Bank in nearly 2 decades. This recent spate of violence, if we give it a new starting point, was when the Israeli Defense Force entered the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank. Why did they do that, and what was happening there?
Sure. I mean, as you say, with this conflict, you can always go step back. But if we look at it this year, you're right. We had this raid on Jenin refugee camp. Jenin refugee camp is in the north of the occupied West Bank. It's been a center of armed resistance to the Israeli forces. I was there in November, December, met some of the militant groups. They are a coalition of local guys who have affiliations with different groups, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Fatah. Some of these groups on a bigger level are rivals with each other, right? But on this local level, they're cooperating together. And some of the attacks that we'd seen last year as well in Israel were carried out by people who came from around Jenin or in Jenin itself. This latest incident was a raid where the Israelis said they had intelligence of an active plot by members of Islamic Jihad to carry out attacks. So they launched a raid. In that raid, 7 members of the armed militant groups were killed. 2 civilians, including a 61-year-old woman, were killed. And it caused a lot of anger amongst Palestinians. It was one of the deadliest single incidents that we've seen, certainly in the occupied West Bank, for quite a number of years. And then just a few days after that, we saw this terrible shooting by a Palestinian man from East Jerusalem outside a synagogue on a settlement that was built in East Jerusalem, in which 7 Israelis were gunned down. I was there in the aftermath of that shooting as well. There was a lot of grief, as you can imagine, from amongst the Israeli side. There's also a lot of anger because they wanted, many of the people that we spoke to, they wanted to see an even tougher response than what the government has been coming up with. They were, in fact, voicing concerns about figures like Ben Gvir being too moderate.
So how has this new right-wing government exerted its power? Benjamin Netanyahu has already set out a raft of measures to crack down on those Palestinians who attack Israelis, including making it easier for Israeli citizens to carry guns, and stripping the rights of the family members of any of the attackers.
התשובה שלנו לטרור היא יד קשה, לתגובה עוצמתית, מהירה ומדויקת.
And the new National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has even spoken about wanting to reinstate the death penalty. Palestinians call these reforms collective punishment. This all comes as tens of thousands of Israelis have been regularly rallying against proposals by the new government to overhaul the judiciary, which they fear will threaten the country's democratic values.
That I think really just shows the gulf in understanding between the two sides, because I mean the vast majority of Palestinian attackers who are carrying out attacks end up being killed as a result of them, and they know that. So something like the death sentence doesn't really seem like it's going to be an effective deterrence. But speaking to ordinary people, it was one of the things that they had latched onto. They wanted to see it. As much as there was Israeli anger at that terrible shooting in East Jerusalem, amongst Palestinians who I was talking to, they saw that even when they didn't necessarily endorse the shooting of civilians like that, but they saw it as an almost natural response to the attack and the raid in Jenin. And the Israelis would say there's not a comparison because we were launching an intelligence-led operation, but for Palestinians it was a example of tit for tat violence.
But in terms of trying to understand, the figureheads who we've mentioned from the Israeli government now, and as you say, they come from the settler community. So they're from the Israeli settlements on the occupied territories, which internationally the Israeli settlements are illegal. But they don't see it that way, the Israeli settlers or the Israeli government.
They see it as their biblical right. Yeah. I mean, and the ideologically driven ones. They see it.
Yeah, and you went there and met some of these people. Can you just talk about meeting them and how they view this?
Yeah, I mean, look, we met, in fact, this youngish woman she was born in America, had come over as...
Bashi,
yep. Exactly. And she was, with her family, she was part of the kind of, let's say, most radical fringe of the settler community, and they were involved in setting up so there's two different types of settlements that you have in Israel. You have the big, large housing complexes that are, as you say, considered illegal internationally, but that Israel disputes that. Then you have these small illegal outposts, and even Israel considers those outposts illegal, and it can often be started just by a family or a handful of families pitching up with some tents, on a hilltop and saying, right, this is our land. And at times in the past, the Israeli forces would then come and shift them out. At times they wouldn't, but certainly legally they were meant to do that. This new government, Ben Gvir, Bezalel, Smotrich, they're ideologically driven settlers. They want to see a regularization of these smaller outposts. And, there's this phrase that the settler community had, was that, not only did they want to settle the land and build more homes, but they wanted to settle in the hearts of the public. And now they're really settled in the heart of the new Israeli government.
It seems very much, reading around this, looking at your reports, that the idea of a two-state solution seems to be completely gone at the moment. America's focused on China, America's focused on Russia and Ukraine. Does it feel like, almost, especially from Washington, that they don't seem to be as interested in a peace process anymore?
Yeah, I mean, there's no peace process, and that visit by the US Secretary of State, that wasn't about trying to find a solution or a resolution to this conflict. That was at best an attempt at a bit of crisis management to prevent an already bad situation getting, even worse and deteriorating further. Since then, it's gone out of the headlines. You're right, there hasn't been incidents that have picked up that much Western media attention. There was a raid in Jericho just a few days ago. 5 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces. Israelis were looking for men who'd carried out a shooting on a restaurant in a settlement in which no one was injured. So at the moment, we're kind of at a stage where there's pretty much every day there's something happening. There's something. But a lot of the time, because it's on an almost daily level and it's at a fairly low level from an international perspective, not if you're living through it, of course, on the ground, it feels like it's at a simmering point, but it's not quite boiling over. And I think maybe that visit was about concerns that at some stage it could boil over.
And, we have mainly been talking about those right-wing voters, right-wing individuals, but also we have seen, as you alluded to before, every week people protesting on the streets of Tel Aviv about judicial reforms, about concerns about the government changing the judiciary in a way that it would be more ideological, but more political. So, he's also facing those domestic pressures from people who are concerned within Israel about the direction of the government.
Yeah, I mean, the protests in Tel Aviv, which has been the center of this movement, I mean, they've been huge. We're talking about tens of thousands of people in a pretty small, numerically, country. And they've been coming out, and as you say, the plans that they're against have been proposed by Netanyahu's government, and it would allow the government Parliament to vote down rulings by the Supreme Court if they have a simple majority, and it also allows it allows politicians to have a greater role in electing which judges go on to sit on the Supreme Court bench. So, that's a deep fissure within Israeli society. Not all of those people who are coming out and protesting are necessarily all that sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. Some of them are. And they're from the Israeli left. Others are just angry at what they see as an attempt to really reduce Israel's democratic nature.
There has been talk recently, perhaps, that this violence is precluding to a possible third intifada. What does it mean when we talk about this being the start of a possible third intifada? Well, the word intifada is Arabic for uprising and translates basically to mean shaking off. In this context, it refers to two periods when the Palestinian people rose up against the Israeli occupation. The first intifada started in 1987 and lasted 6 years. The second one began in 2005, following the failure of the Camp David Accords and when then opposition leader Ariel Sharon made a controversial visit to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or the Temple Mount, in Jerusalem. That second intifada lasted 5 years, and during that time, just over 1,000 Israelis lost their lives, with over 3,000 Palestinians killed. There have been times since 2005 when it felt like the region was on the cusp of another uprising. The question is whether the current intransigence on both sides is that moment. If the peace process seems to be dead completely, that might be what happens next.
Certainly, the peace process is absolutely dead. There's no prospect it seems viable prospect of a two-state solution becoming a reality. Where you have an expansion of settlements in the occupied West Bank territory that's internationally recognized as being Palestinian, that totally undermines the prospect of a viable, functioning, separate, independent Palestinian state. When you go there and you speak to young Palestinians, it seems as if there's a generation there who are wanting to have their voice heard, and
they talk about that a third intifada, or
it is. Yeah, it's on the lips. I mean,
and it's on the lips of the Israelis in terms of their concerns.
Absolutely, it's a third intifada. Some people even say we're already in the early stages of a third intifada, because you see these low-level incidents. You've got these raids by the Israelis. You've got shooting, stabbing, car ramming attacks, sometimes carried out by Palestinians. So perhaps we're in an early stage of it. I mean, the one thing that's different, perhaps, is that the Israeli security apparatus is even stronger than it was in the past. So the possibility, for example, of major bombings, of suicide bombings, that doesn't seem to be that realistic. But a major uprising, that seems a distinct possibility. I mean, one of the things I think to watch out for is what happens to the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, because its leader, Mahmoud Abbas, is very old. He's been in power a long, long time. There have been no elections held for a long, long time. And after he passes away, there's going to be some kind of leadership crisis, really. And that's something that a lot of people are concerned about internationally, because that could be the kind of moment in which maybe there's internal conflict amongst the Palestinian side, but it could also be the kind of spark that sets fire to a wider uprising. The other thing to look out for, I think, is what happens to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. That's the religious site at the heart of Jerusalem and the heart of this conflict in some ways as well. People like Ben Gvir, because
we visited there.
Yeah, exactly, because it's the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. It's holy to Muslims. Jews revere it as the Temple Mount. Itamar Ben Gvir in the past has talked about wanting to change the rules there, the status quo, as it's known, to allow Jews to pray more publicly. he's rode back from that position in more recent times, but he visited there, as you say, a couple of weeks back. That raised a lot of tensions, even within the region. Something like that could be the kind of, any changes to the status there could be another spark that sets it on light. But it's also possible that we see this kind of low-level simmering that's kind of, terrible for everyone involved, and that might just go on and on and on.
Secunder Kermani, thank you very much for talking to me. Thank you.
Thank you.